we're going to learn three things. The first thing we're going to learn is from the Gemara, and then the Shulchan Aruch, the laws of Tu B'Shvat as they appear in the Shulchan Aruch. After we've learned that, we're going to go to another book that sort of, I suppose, expands Tu B'Shvat into the bigger deal that it is today. We'll talk about that expansion. And then the third thing that we're going to do is we're going to, I suppose, look maybe at some of the like the meaning of Tu B'Shvat, and really as a way to try to understand the halachot. So it's like we'll start with section number 1, halacha, and then how Tu B'Shvat has expanded to become a much bigger deal today. But this is post Shulchan Aruch, after the book of Jewish law, and then we're going to look at a book of Chassidut that really explains the first section, and that is the Shulchan Aruch on Tu B'Shvat. At the moment, that's probably not very clear summary, but I hope Be'ezrat Hashem at the end of our learning, it'll be a much clearer thing to do. Okay, so just by way of introduction, when I was a little boy, which was quite a long time ago now actually, Tu B'Shvat, especially in England, was not such a big deal. There was I don't remember as a child ever doing, Su'udat Tu B'Shvat. Have any of you ever heard of a Su'udat Tu B'Shvat? Indeed, Be'ezrat Hashem, exactly a week from now, right in this very room, we will engage in a Su'udat Tu B'Shvat, where you sort of sit around, sing some songs, eat some nuts, and eat some Israeli fruits of the land of Israel. That idea I don't remember it as a child. I'm not sure if it existed here, but in general, Tu B'Shvat has really become a much more exciting sort of day in the Jewish calendar relatively recently in Jewish history. Like, it never had a standing, it's really quite a minor day in the Jewish calendar, but it's become a much bigger deal, and we're going to talk a little bit about why that might be the case. Okay, so let's start with the first mention of Tu B'Shvat. The first time that we hear about Tu B'Shvat is a Mishnah in the Masechet Rosh Hashanah. In fact, it is the very first Mishnah of Masechet Rosh Hashanah, and just so happens to be the first source on our sheet. And the Mishnah says as follows: Arba'a Rashi Shanim Heim. There are 4 days that are considered as Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah means the head of the year. Head, like the head of the year. So we know, obviously, one of them is the beginning of the Jewish year, the first day of Tishrei. That is Rosh Hashanah, number 1. Well, actually, the first one is actually the first day of Nisan. Rosh Hashanah leMalachim, it's the new year for kings. So when they count how many years a king has reigned, so when you get to the first day of Nisan, you move up to the next year. So if you have a king that became a king during the month of Adar, so then once you get to Nisan, which is just could be a couple of days or weeks later, you would then speak about the second year of his reign. The end of the first year of the reign is the last day of Adar. The beginning of the second year is the first of Nisan, and then the third year. So we count the years of the reign of a king by the first day of Nisan. Now, that we know that from last week's parasha, in Parashat Bo, we're told that the first month of the year is Nisan. Nachon? HaChodesh hazeh lachem Rosh Chodashim. God, the first commandment that He gave to the Jewish people as a nation was this month, meaning the month of Nisan. That's the month in which we came out of Egypt. This month is the first month of the year. And when I was a kid, when we would list the Jewish months, we used to start with Nisan. Nisan Yasivan Tamaz. Like when kids you'd ramble off the months of the year. So Nisan is the first month, and indeed we count the kings from the first of Nisan. The second new head of the year is Echad Be'elul. That's the first day of Elul. Rosh Hashanah leMaaser Behema. That is the new year for tithes of animals. Now I'm not going to go into the details of that, Rav Elazar of Rabbi Shimon Omrim Bechad B'Tishrei, they argue and say, no, we tithe the animals. The amount, when you calculate how much you're supposed to, when you give the 10th animal, so in what time frame? So the time frame is a year until the first of Elul, and then after the first of Elul, that's already the following year in calculating how much to give. Okay, Bechad B'Tishrei, the third one is the first day of Tishrei. Rosh Hashanah l'Shanim, that's when you move up until a new year. So we're now 5785. Be'ezrat Hashem, when we come to the first day of Tishrei, we will change the year from 5785 to 5786. That's where the year goes up by one. Shemitah is counted by the first of Tishrei, and Yovel is also counted by the first of Tishrei. Now, let's go to the last one. The last line now of this Mishnah. Bechad B'Shvat, on the first day of Shvat, Rosh Hashanah La'ilan. That is the new year for trees. Kedivrei Beit Shammai. This is the opinion of Beit Shammai. Beit Hillel Omrim, but the house of Hillel say no. B'Chamisha Asar Bo, that we do not commemorate this new year for trees on the first day, but rather you commemorate it on the 15th of Shvat. Okay, we, as I'm sure you know, since we call the festival Tu B'Shvat, which literally means the 15th, so you know the answer already, that we rule that the new year for trees is Tu B'Shvat. What does it mean, the new year for trees? Like, trees don't need a birthday, but it's also a bit like the Maaseh Behemah. We have various tithes that you have to give. During some years you give Maaseh Ani, you give to the poor, and other years we give to Maaser Sheni, that we take the tithes and we eat them here in Jerusalem. So if I have an apple on the tree, so which year is this apple part of? Is this, if the apple is on the tree, let's say on the third day of Tishrei, do you say and they take it off the tree? So is it an apple of this year or of the previous year? So we look on now, most of the trees now do not have a lot going on. They're quite quiet. And we're going to discuss that a little bit later in more detail. But the buds, when the blossoming starts soon. So when I count what year a tree is, I count the fruit of the trees from after Tu B'Shvat. So any produce that started growing now, that is, say, pre-Tu B'Shvat, I say it's part of last year. And anything that starts growing from now, Tu B'Shvat onwards, I say is part of this year's produce. Does that make sense? So, there are lots of important ramifications for that we won't go into now, but maybe just one little thing concerning Shemitah, for example. So let's say I have an apple on my tree, and the apple starts growing in, let's say 3 months' time, which would be in Iyar, right? So if it starts blossoming now, but I only pick it off the tree, I only take it off the tree next year. I only take it off the tree in Cheshvan, because, they can stay on the tree for a while. So how do I calculate which year this apple is from? Is this apple from this year or is it from the previous year? So Tu B'Shvat is anything that starts, I look at the trees now, and anything that starts blossoming now is from this year's trees. Does that make sense to everybody? So it means that I could pull an apple off the tree after Rosh Hashanah, and even though Shemitah might start on Rosh Hashanah, the apple will be this year's apple and not next year's apple. You follow? And likewise, at the end of Shemitah year, so I could have an apple that I could pull off the tree a month after Shemitah, but it would still be a Shemitah apple because it started growing the previous year. You follow? So that's what the new year for trees means. It's really a technical measure of defining how do I deal with the produce. It's really like a technical mechanism for me to know, is this tree part of year A produce, or is this fruit part of tree B produce? To know which year this fruit is from. So Tu B'Shvat is the end of the previous year's produce and the beginning of this year's produce. Is that clear to everybody? That is Tu B'Shvat in the Talmud. Now, if we go from the Talmud and go to the Gemara, so the Gemara says...
From the Mishnah to the Gemara.
I'm sorry, from the Mishnah to the Gemara, right. Echad b'Shvat Rosh Hashanah Ilan Ma'itama Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Hoshaya Hoil v'Yatzu Rov Geshmi Hashana. Because, how appropriate. It's towards the end of the winter. It's not the end of the winter. Please God, a month from now it'll still be pouring with rain. But most of the rain, I hope this year we've had very little rain, but in most years the majority of the rain has already fallen. So it's not the end of the year, but the flowers are beginning to start to blossom. The first flowers are beginning to blossom, and that's why we have Tu B'Shvat now. Is that clear to everybody? So far, everything we've said, based on the Mishnah, and then subsequently based on the Gemara, I wouldn't call Tu B'Shvat a festival, based on what we've said until now. I would call an interesting date for the calendar. It's not a day of celebration. No miracles happened on this day. It's really just a technical mechanism with which I can measure things. A bit like there's a particular day that I'm counting the years of King 1 and King 2, so I want to know how many years he reigned. So I'm not going to go by, how many. I'm not going to necessarily remember the day of the coronation and then count the coronation. So you have a day that once you pass that day, that's the cutoff for counting how many years he reigned. I mean, it's interesting, but it's not a day to commemorate with celebrations where you all wear crowns. And Tu B'Shvat seems to be a similar sort of demarcation in the calendar. It's just a technical day based on the Mishnah and based on the Gemara. Is that clear to everybody? Okay, I just want to make one comment to you. And I mean, it's interesting for everybody, but it follows on from our conversation earlier. There's an argument between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai that we will look at in some detail a bit later on, where Beit Shammai say we should commemorate this technical day, commemorate it on the first day of Shvat, and Beit Hillel say no, don't commemorate on the first, commemorate it on the 15th. So we know halakha, we rule it's the 15th, but I would be interested to explore what they arguing about. Like why, when Beit Shammai said we commemorate this day on the first of the month, I mean all the others are on the first of the month, so let's commemorate it on the first of the month. And then Beit Hillel says no, not the first of the month, the 15th of the month. That's intriguing that they would argue on that point. Why would that be a point of conflict between them? What world view would Beit Hillel have that would convince him that the correct day to demarcate this particular cutoff is the 15th of the month? And for Beit Shammai, I'd say not that, on the first of the month. But that's just continuing our discussion, but an interesting thing for us all to contemplate. Okay, that is the Mishnah and the Gemara. Joy. Okay, now look at this. This is quite unusual. Look at the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch, as you know, is based. We haven't got time to go through all the other sources, but you obviously go from the Gemara to the Rambam, and then to the Shulchan Aruch. So listen what he says. He says, this is I'm going to say this with some hesitancy, because I'm not 100% sure, but I think this is correct. Nahagu, there is a custom, Shelo lipol al panehem, not to say tachanun, on the 15th of Av, and likewise also not on the 15th of Shvat. Do you see that statement by the Shulchan Aruch? Okay. Now I'm not going to continue reading them. It gives various other times when we don't say tachanun. Now, I'll tell you why this is an unusual comment. Not unusual, but it's something that should pique our interest. Tachanun, as you all know, is a prayer that we say on a normal day of the year. But whenever there's a celebration, like Shabbat, or Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Purim, whenever Chanukah, whenever there's an exciting day, we don't say Tachanun. On the day of a Brit Milah, the mohel and the father of the baby and the person holding the baby do not say Tachanun. If somebody gets married, for a week after the wedding, that person doesn't say Tachanun, and anyone in the shul with the mohel or the groom or the father of the baby, no one in the shul says Tachanun because it's a celebration. So understand, not saying Tachanun needs a reason, and the reason not to say Tachanun has to be some sort of celebration. So I am intrigued by the fact that the Shulchan Aruch says no Tachanun on Tu B'Shvat. And I would say, why not? It's not, what are we commemorating? Now, what's the justification not to say Tachanun on Tu B'Shvat? I've only seen in Tu B'Shvat a very technical mechanism with which I can distinguish the produce of last year from the produce of this year. But it's not like a celebration. Oh, there's last year's produce, and look at this. It's really just a very technical process. So how does that point justify no Tachanun? Is that question clear to everybody? That question is what we're going to spend the rest of our in various ways. Spend our time trying to understand that question. Is that clear to everybody? Comments, suggestions? L'chaim.
Maybe add a tiny thing to it. It's also reference point for Orla.
Correct.
Yeah.
But still, nachon. I count the years. I count exactly. You're quite right. It's counting the number of years. Orla.
If you even can eat it, let's put
Correct.
it that way.
See, we don't have a celebration after you wait 6 hours, and I can now have my. I mean, that's.
Well, that's a couple of years, I would say.
I see. Okay. Orla. You know that for the first 3 years, when a sapling is growing, and if it produces fruit during those 3 years, we're not allowed to eat the fruit for those first 3 years. How old do I know a tree is? I know the age of the tree from Tu B'Shvat. So every Tu B'Shvat that it passes, it goes up by 1 year. I think, but I'm not 100% sure on this, I think you might need to plant the tree a month before Tu B'Shvat. I mean, you can't have this crazy planting fest. On the day before Tu B'Shvat, so then it could be a year old immediately.
Yeah.
I think you might need to plant it earlier than the previous, but I'm not sure on that.
I'm not sure either.
Okay. Everything clear but the question is clear to everybody. Yeah? Okay. So now look at this. Maybe I'll strengthen the question. If everything that we said until now is true, that it's not really a big celebration, why is it that people do make such a big deal about Tu B'Shvat? You will see people having real parties, like can you speak? Hebrew, they speak like this very unique accent in Poland. So I remember when one of our kids was little, they were in school, they organized something, and I didn't hear what they were saying. They said it again and again and again until I got it. He said, we're having for Tu B'Shvat Tish Pyrus. Do you know what Tish Pyrus is? Tish
This is a table.
Tish Peirot.
Yes.
Like a Peirot, like a Hasidic Tish with fruit.
Pyrus.
So the Hasidim call this a Tish Pyrus. Tish Pyrus. But what are you celebrating? It's just a year later. We don't have this big, on the day that the king reigned for another year, we don't commemorate. We don't have kings nowadays, but I'm not sure there was any big celebration at that time of the time of the Beit HaMikdash that we would count this. the time when we had kings. Anyway, so it's interesting that Tu B'Shvat seems to have very little cause or very little justification for the huge celebration that exists. Okay, is that clear to everybody? So, in order to understand that, we're going to look at two sources. The first source, I actually put this is the front cover of the book. This is the first source that I'm aware of that mentions celebrating Tu B'Shvat. We saw in the Shulchan Aruch that mentions almost as a side note, and if you don't, I sort of build it into a question. But if you, Tu B'Shvat, no Tachanun, maybe, there's sort of you could say, well, you don't need a lot of justification not to Tachanun. It's within a list of many festivals that don't have Tachanun. But if you look in this book, there was this book. Now, I read that it was written anonymously, although here I see a name was given. There was a rabbi called Binyamin Halevi. And Binyamin Halevi lived in Sfat during the 17th century, the 1600s. And living in the 1600s in Tzfat, listen to what he says. Minhag tov, it is a good custom, laholchim betamim, laharbot bepeirot be'etzem hayom hazeh. It is worthy and good to eat fruit on Tu B'Shvat. V'lomar divrei shirot v'tishbachot, and give praise to God on them. Kasher hinhagti b'chol hachiburim asher mati umori, as I learned from my teacher, Haya Omer, lechaven b'achilat peiroteim letikun chet adam harishon, asher chata b'peirot ha'ilan. And my eating of fruit on Tu B'Shvat is fixing the sin of Adam when he ate produce without permission. Ki af kol yimei shana kol kavanatenu l'tikun zeh mikol makam chaviva mitzvah b'sha'ata. There seems to be a value in eating fruit on Tu B'Shvat. Okay, notice, just by the by, everybody, that this is not based on any statements earlier, not that I'm aware of, in a Midrash or the Gemara. There's no hint of this. There's no anchor that you could attach. This seems to be an idea that he came with, although he does say that I learned it from my teachers. So it could be that he's describing something in 16th century, in 17th century Sfat, describing something that perhaps continued previously. But the first person to recall the idea of having fruit is this rabbi in Sfat in the 16th century. 17th, sorry, I'm getting confused there. Okay, that's number one. I'm going to go to the next page.
What was his name?
His name was Rabbi Binyamin Halevi. And I only know that he lived in the 1600s and that he lived in Tzfat. Now notice the Magen Avraham. The Magen Avraham lived later. He, perhaps reading this book, mentions, do you see the Magen Avraham? B'rosh Shana La'ilan, quoting the Shulchan Aruch that we read earlier. The Shulchan Aruch said that there's no Tachanun on Tu B'Shvat. When we said there's no Tachanun on Tu B'Shvat, the Magen Avraham commentating on the Shulchan Aruch says, Noagim ha'Ashkenazim laharbot b'minei peirot shel ilanot. There is a custom of Ashkenazim to eat fruit on Tu B'Shvat. So we see that these words from the 16th century, from the 17th century, pre-Eitz Hadar, made it into the commentary of the Magen Avraham in the 18th century, although he does not quote the book that we looked at. Then if we go to the 20th century, the Mishnah Berurah, also commenting on this same statement, and I think this is the only reference to Tu B'Shvat in the Shulchan Aruch, that there's no Tachanun. The only thing we know about Tu B'Shvat is no Tachanun. So the Mishnah Berurah also commenting on that Rosh Tu B'Shvat is the new year for trees. Noagim Ashkenazim larbot az b'minei perot shel ilanot, quoting like the Magen Avraham. So we see it's become an established custom to eat fruit on Tu B'Shvat, perhaps from the words of this book in Sfat in the 1600s. And indeed, nowadays there is a custom for people to eat fruit on Tu B'Shvat. However, what remains difficult is what are we celebrating? we sort of like building up this celebration. What are we celebrating? Really, the core question. If we could answer that core question, perhaps I would answer everything. And the core question is, why no tachanun? Like, what's the joy? What's the joy that would push away the need to say tachanun? So for that, I'd like to learn a little bit of Chassidut with you. Now, I know this is a long piece, but we're not going to read it all. We're just going to read snippets of it, and we're going to learn a really very, very powerful idea about Tu B'Shvat. I have to say, I enjoyed this immensely, learning this. We will, first of all, learn about what are we celebrating on Tu B'Shvat, and we will also answer the question of what's the argument between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Why did Beit Shammai say the first, and why did Beit Hillel say the 15th? Joy, happiness. Okay, so let's go right in. Okay, I'm going to start. The first bit presents a question, which we're going to read together, and then we're going to go to the answer. Yesh litbonen. We need to think. Oh, let me just tell you who we're reading. I'm so sorry. We're learning from the words of the Shem Mishmuel. Shem Mishmuel is a rabbi who lived in the 19th century. 19th century, yeah. Oh, well, I think he died in around 1920. But he was active at the turn of the century, about just over 100 years ago. And he lived in a place called Sokachov, that I pronounced incorrectly, so I apologize.
No, pronounced perfectly.
Oh, you're such a polite person. But that's where he's from, which is a small town in Poland.
Right.
And he wrote a commentary on the 5 books of the Torah, but then he intertwined comments on the festivals as he got to them. So in his book on the book of Shemot, because Tu B'Shvat always falls in the book of Shemot, so then there are a couple of teachings about Tu B'Shvat within his commentary of Shemot. Like all Hasidic Rebbes, he would teach on Shabbat, and then either he or his students would then transcribe the teachings after Shabbat. So this was taught. Do we even know which year? We don't know which year it was. Okay.
1927?
No, what year he taught this? I don't know. Okay, so we need to think about Tu B'Shvat. She'ein omrim bo tachanun. That we don't say tachanun. Va'alo mashu Rosh Hashanah la'ilan hu davar tiv'i shi'atzu rov geshmi hashana va'ala saraf ba'ilano v'nimtzu ha'peirot chon tim me'ata u'ma inyan shelo yomar b'tachanun. What is there on Tu B'Shvat that could justify not saying tachanun? We don't see. We're not commemorating anything holy. There's no mitzvah that we perform on this day. No miracle happened on that day. It's not even a Jewish story. It's not like it doesn't. There's no event in Jewish history that we commemorate on Tu B'Shvat. So I am intrigued, says the Shem Shmuel, Rav Shmuel Bornstein of Sokachov. I'm intrigued that we celebrate it. Now, contrast this, he says, the 15th of Av. So the Talmud tells us at the end of Masechet Ta'anit about various miracles, various good things that happened on Tu B'Av, and those happy events that we won't go into now. The happy events that happened on Tu B'Av justify not saying Tachanun on the 15th of Av. But we're not told of any similar activities on Tu B'Shvat. Aval Tu B'Shvat, Marabutim Didei. What happened on Tu B'Shvat? Is that clear to everybody? Clear to everybody? Tu B'Av, I understand. You all are probably familiar with the story mentioned in the Gemara about how the women, the women would dance. And then, as people would find their soulmates. And the Midrash also talks about, we have Tisha B'Av, and then we're getting up after Tisha B'Av. So I understand the celebration of Tu B'Av, 15th of Av, but there's no story, there's no narrative for Tu B'Shvat that like there is for Tu B'Av. You follow? Okay. Now, he speaks a little bit about trees, about what, like celebrating the birthday of a tree. and then he does a nice little parallel between trees and people, and then through that, then he comes to talk about the celebration of Tu B'Shvat. So now where are we up to? Venira. It appears to me, Dine Kativ, Ki Kasher Yeret HaKeshem HaShelek Min HaShamayim, V'shama Lo Yashov Ki Mervat Haaretz V'olida V'tzmicha, Ken Yeh Devari Asher Yetzei Mipi. So he quotes from Yeshayahu Navi, who draws a parallel between rain, how appropriate for now, rain and teaching Torah. I'm just going to translate the verse. Just like when it rains, rain and snow comes from heaven. And then when the rain lands on the ground, that rain landing on the ground gives the ground sustenance, and it starts to grow. For Holy David, smicha, it will start, turning green. So too, when the words that come from my mouth, says God. So like the rain lands on the ground, and then it gives the ground power, sort of like brings the ground back to life again. So too says Isaiah the prophet, that when I teach Torah to the Jewish people, so then when Torah enters our ears, so it sustains us. You hear that? Do you hear that parallel? Okay. Hine himshil hanavi davar Hashem likshamim hamatmichem. The prophet Isaiah compared rain to the teaching of God's word. Just like rain sustains the ground, so God's word sustains us. V'nirati hine inyan ha'ilan hu mitchaber tapri la'aretz. What a tree connects the fruit to the ground. Really, the fruit doesn't just land, it goes through a process. The rain goes onto the ground, the ground gives the tree the energy, and then the tree produces the fruit. You follow? Nachon? Did I say that right? It rains, the tree grows, and then the tree produces a fruit. So the tree is like the middleman between the rain and the fruit. You follow? You don't rain and then get fruit. You rain and then the tree grows, and then the tree produces a fruit. So the tree is the middleman between the fruit and the rain. Nachon? Yesh bo koach hamechaper. V'niran teremez yesh b'gematria shelo ilan. The gematria of ilan is 91, which is the same as the two names of God. And then he says, just like the tree sort of connects heaven and earth, so too God's teaching connects. We become the connect. Ki Adam Eitz HaSadeh. We become the way of connecting God's world with the world. Am I making sense there? So you have the rain on the trees produces fruit, God's words to us, and then do you know what happens when we then do the right thing? Is that clear to everybody? If you go right to the end of the last source over here, look at this. Elu Devarim Sha'adam Ochel Peirotehem, the fruits of our labor. So my mitzvot are my fruit. You follow? Because we say over here, these are the things a person is, sustained. The peirot means the fruits. Literally, we say this: the fruits of my labor. So you have the rain onto the tree to produce fruit, and you have the Torah into my ears produces mitzvot. I become a more refined person. In fact, I'll just mention, we mentioned this many, many times, and I'll mention it again. And maybe this is to contrast, if I'm studying for an academic degree. So let's say I'm doing a degree in, geography. So then, when I go to a lecture, at the end of the lecture in geography, I now know a little bit more about the world, right? I understand something that I didn't know beforehand. But I haven't changed as a person. But when I engage in Torah study, which is, I think, different to perhaps other study, so there it's God's word coming into me, and the result is that I produce fruit. My fruit are the good deeds that I do. In other words, it's more than just a mashal. It means that I become a more refined individual. It means that, let's say I spend 6 months in Machon Meir, and then I haven't spoken to my parents for a little while, or I spend time with my parents, and then they see me, and I spent 6 months learning Torah, and they go, wow, my gosh, you're such a sweet, they see that I become a better person. That means that it's been an effective learning project. Is that clear? What I mean to say is that my learning should cause me to produce fruit. And fruit, I'm explaining, means that my interactions are better. I become a more refined individual. That people look at me and say, wow, he's a better person as a result of what he's doing. Is that clear to you? That process is the same process as what happens to the tree. You have the rain, tree, fruit, God's word, Torah, and then I become a more refined is part of it, but it's really just like a more wholesome. I need to be a better person. If somebody spends 10 years in university, they might end after 10 years and be a very bright person. But if I spend 10 years in yeshiva and I leave yeshiva, I would expect this person to be not just wise, but also to be righteous, because that's part of the process of learning Torah. It's my fruit. Is that mashal clear to everybody? Joy? I think it's a really brilliant little idea. Is that clear to everybody so far? How are you doing, Fabrizio? Thank you so much for your drink. Okay, I'm going to skip now a bit. I'm going to go now to the end of the first paragraph. It's the middle of a line, and it says, Ma'aseh ha-mitzvah b'tachtonim. When I do a good deed in this world, v'haruchaniyut shebo מהעליונים דומה לאילן שיש בו כוח המחבר ומוציא פרי שיש בו חיבור. אף שנמצא פרי הארץ שיש בהם רוחניות ומוצא פי השם, ומכל מקום אינו נעשה על ידי עצמאי. כמו שנמצא גם בבקורת הארץ, מקום מקדש שהיה מעולם מחבר עליונים ותחתונים. אף בלי האמצעות האדם, אלא שהקדושה שבמצוות היא באמצעות האדם. He says there's lots of good in the world, there's not as a result of me, or as a result of people, but my peirot, my goodness, is as a result of being, spiritually, if that's sustained. Like there's physical rain, and then there's like I don't know how to call it, like a sustenance. When I receive my sustenance, the result is that I become a more refined individual, and I, like the tree, produce my fruit, which is that which I'm able to contribute to society. Is that clear to everybody? That's the model. Okay. Is everything clear until now? Now we're now going to move this to Tu B'Shvat. This is absolutely brilliant. Be prepared. I'm now on the last 2 lines of the first page. Hine, kamo agashamim agashmim, just like physical rain. מתגלות פעולתם באילנות אחר שליש השנה שעלה שרף באילנות ונמצאו הפירות חונטים מעתה, כן נמי מראש השנה ואילך לצדיקים שנכתבים ונחתמים לעתה לחיים. He says, this parallel with trees goes even further. As you know, the first third of the year, the Jewish year, that is to say, from Rosh Hashanah, so that's Tishrei, Cheshvan, Kislev, Tevet, Shvat. We're finished in Nisan. Did I get that right? Tishrei, Cheshvan, Kislev, Tevet, 4 months, which is 1/3 of the year, right? So in Israel it only rains, you have a rainy season, So we're coming towards the end of the rainy season. But for the most of the rainy season, I look at the trees and nothing happened to them. Meaning, so you can have rain all the way through September, October, November, December, and the trees are just sitting there and they're just branches, no leaves. Now, in Shvat, I begin to see the trees waking up. I begin to see the trees waking up after sort of 1/3 of the year that they've been, all the action's been going on beneath the surface. So too, says the Shem Shmuel, with people and Dvar Hashem. If we talk about watering the trees and you see no impact, the same is true of us as individuals. It's a very long process of, internalizing God consciousness. Like the process of becoming more aware is a long process. I could water my soul for 4 months, from till Tevet, and not see anything. Where nowadays there's instant gratification. Things need to happen straight away. Just like in a tree, the process of rain to fruit is a very, very long process. So too with human beings, the process from rain to fruit is also a very long process. I could not expect to to engage in some sort of life-changing decision, and then the following day immediately feel that everything is different. It's a bit like finding a sapling and then watering it and then coming up the next day to pick an orange. It doesn't work like that. The sustenance is to be continued and steadily over a significant chunk of time, and it's only after that investment of day after day after day after day, and not seeing any results, despite the fact that I'm doing it every single day, like watering a tree during the winter, or the rain in the tree in the winter, that sustained effort without seeing any progress. It's only after that sustained effort with no progress that eventually you're able to start seeing the blossom. Is that clear? Is that clear to everybody? I want to read that inside here. You know what? I'm actually going to jump to the. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 lines down on the last page. He says, kasher avar shlish hashana. Once we've finished 1/3 of the year, and indeed we have now just finished 1/3 of the year, 4 months, 1/3 of the year. ונשלמה בחינת הלב, מתחיל זמן יותר בהיר לתורה ולעבודה, אחר שעברו ירחין, תעשו ומכינים עצמם ל4 פרשיות שבאדר ופורים וניסן ופסח וספירה ושבועות. He says, really, the first 4 months are very quiet months. In terms of Jewish faith, there's not very much going on. Because really all the effort is all going on behind the scenes. A bit like watering the tree. He says there is a very powerful parallel between the process that a tree goes through and the process that a person goes through. At the beginning of the year, I have this beautiful tree, and then it loses everything when it comes to autumn, fall, and then you come to Rosh Hashanah, and then it's really quite empty. And then I spend 4 months. Well, God spends 4 months, causing rain to come onto the tree, and nothing. I see absolutely nothing. And then 4 months later, the tree wakes up, and then it starts to blossom. So too with us. I go through a transformative experience on Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah, as we were saying, is the day that I connect to God's word. It's the day that maybe things opened up for me. It could have been a day of great seriousness, great, really heightened God consciousness. But then I'll see nothing has immediate results. Just like the tree, You water it day after day after day for 4 months, like the tree. And then after 4 months, you begin to see blossoming. And then as soon as it blossoms, the way in our Jewish year it works, so you go straight from Tu B'Shvat. You had quite a few months, but then immediately after Tu B'Shvat, you go straight to Purim, and then straight after Purim, it's straight to Pesach. It's like bang, bang, bang. After all that work under the cover, behind the scenes, then we begin to see literally the fruits of our labor that I was unable to appreciate until now. Is that clear to everybody? The celebration of Tu B'Shvat, according to the Shemesh Shmuel, is the beginning of the realization of the efforts that we started 4 months ago. Just like the trees are beginning to wake up because they've received 4 months of sustenance and now they're beginning to blossom, I'm beginning to see a little bit of the fruits of my labor in the tree. So too, after 4 months of effort from Rosh Hashanah, which was when I began my spiritual journey, each year, as we come to Rosh Hashanah, that's when we spend time to contemplate and a little bit of a reflection. So I'm beginning now, just like the trees, to feel inside that which I've been investing on for the last 4 months. The celebration of Tu B'Shvat, according to the Shemesh Shmuel, is the reawakening of the world after this prolonged investment. I'm finally beginning to see the fruits of my labor. It was, as he said, the beginning of the blossom. But at the beginning of the blossom isn't just a technical agricultural term. It's describing the beginning of the blossom, not only of the tree, but the beginning of the blossom of me after my Tishrei effort. Now, with all of that, and with this we will conclude, what's the argument now between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai? So the argument between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai is this. It's over here. It's in the penultimate paragraph, but I'm going to summarize it, and you are cordially invited to read it afterwards. He says the question is, when's the beginning of the process? According to Beit Shammai, the beginning of the process is Rosh Hashanah, and therefore I wait 4 months from Rosh Hashanah, 1/3 of the year, 4 months from Rosh Hashanah, and then I get to the Rosh Chodesh Shvat, and that's when I begin to see the blossom, beginning to see the fruits of my labor. According to Beit Hillel, the beginning of the process is not the 1st of Tishrei, not Rosh Hashanah, but rather the 15th of Tishrei, which is Sukkot. And the question really goes back to what we were saying right at the beginning about Ahava and Yira, perhaps. That Rosh Hashanah is serving God out of fear. So if that's according to Beit Shammai, that's the beginning of the process. And I have 4 months of the Rosh Hashanah process, and then I'm beginning to see the fruits of that labor, quite literally. But according to Beit Hillel, it's not the process that started on the 1st of Tishrei, that is Rosh Hashanah, Ella. It's the process that started on the 15th of Tishrei, which is Sukkot. And therefore it's 4 months from Sukkot, from Ahava, from love of God. It's 4 months from then that I'm beginning to see the fruits of that labor, and we follow the position of Beit Hillel. It's 4 months. We will commemorate the 4 month, 1/3 of the year since Sukkot. So the celebration of Tu B'Shvat is a celebration of waking up. Like I've invested and I've invested and I've invested, and I haven't seen the fruits of my labor. I've really made a big effort, right? Since Rosh Hashanah, I decided all these important things that I want to work on, and I haven't seen the fruits of those labors. And now, after 4 months of investing, just like the trees are beginning to wake up, so too we are beginning to wake up, and that's why we go straight from Tu B'Shvat to Purim to Pesach, and then afterwards on to all the Chagim that take us through all the way through the summer. So my blessing for all of us is that we will not say Tachanun, that we celebrate the blooming, not just of the trees, but the beginning of waking up of the soul, as it begins to appreciate the effort that I've been investing for the last 4 months, that we should be blessed to feel it, Be'ezrat Hashem, on Tu B'Shvat, and then from then onwards, as we go through all the other much more active Chagim, we've had a quiet season through the winter months, and as we enter the more active season, we should be blessed to feel the blossoming, not just of the trees, but also of ourselves. Yeshar koach lechulchem.